We're going to look at a very famous friendship today, David and Jonathan from the scriptures. For those of you who don't know the story, Jonathan was the son of the reigning king, King Saul. But King Saul had gotten a little cray-cray. He'd gone a little nuts. He'd gotten a little wicked. And so God, who installed Saul as king, chose somebody else, chose a man after his own heart, David, who was just a small boy at that time, but who would ultimately grow up and be the next king. Well, this presented problems not only for Saul, but for his son, Jonathan. You could see how that would be awkward if you're the next one in line to be king, but somebody else is chosen by God to be king. But these two became instant friends. Jonathan, even though he was young, he was already a war hero. He once scaled a cliff and then attacked an army, just he and his armor bearer, all by themselves. David, as just a young man, was the only one with the courage to run out to the line and fight. You remember David and Goliath to fight this giant named Goliath. You could see how they have a lot in common. And the day that David slew Goliath was the day that Jonathan and David became great friends. Let's pick it up, 1 Samuel 18. We're going to look at several different scenes in the friendship of Jonathan and David and see what we can learn from it. Verse 1, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. He was going to keep him around Saul to serve in the king's court. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David and his armor and even his sword and his bow and his belt. You might think that Jonathan is just giving away some of his clothes, but most scholars agree what Jonathan was really doing in this moment was recognizing God has chosen David to be the next king. It's not going to be me. But I believe in the purposes of God. And I think the best use of my gifts, the best use of what's owed to me is to put it in the hands of the future king. I affirm this. I believe this. I love this dude. And I want to partner with what God's doing. Now, Jonathan loved David, but you can see how this would be a difficult thing for King Saul. Over time, King Saul began to grow envious against young David. He began to be suspicious. In fact, he was plotting different ways to kill David. And David slowly begins to tune into this. He goes to Jonathan and tells him about it. And Jonathan's like, what are you talking about? And so Jonathan tries to ascertain from his dad, what is going on? Is this true, Dad? Are you really seeking to put David to death? 1 Samuel 19, let's pick it up there. The next morning, Jonathan spoke with his father about David, saying many good things about him. I love that. I love the way Jonathan is defending David. The king must not sin against his servant David, Jonathan said. He's never done anything to harm you. He has always helped you in any way he could. Have you forgotten about the time he risked his life to kill the Philistine giant and how the Lord brought great victory to all Israel as a result? You were certainly happy about it then. Why should you murder an innocent man like David? There's no reason for it at all. So this time, Saul listened to Jonathan and vowed, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be killed. Afterward, Jonathan called David and told him what had happened. Then he brought David to Saul, and David served in the court as before. So temporarily, these two have been restored to one another. But Saul's only good for a couple of moments, it seems like. And he continues to simmer and continues to burn with jealousy and anger toward David. And David is once again sensing this guy, man, I'm a step away from death. Before long, this dude is really going to kill me. And so Jonathan and he develop a plan. They say, well, there's this feast you're supposed to come to and sit at the king's table, David. Do this. Make up some excuse why you're not going to be there, and then we'll see how the king responds. And if he gets really upset about it, we'll know that he really did want to put you to death. But if he figures it's no big deal, we'll know his heart is cool toward you. Well, they have the dinner, and it does come out that Saul is infuriated that David was not there. In fact, he's so mad he throws a spear at Jonathan. This dude is going nuts, man. His heart has made him so jacked up that he's becoming murderous to the very heir to the throne. So David and Jonathan had worked out a signal. Jonathan would go into the field and have a little play target practice. He'd fire an arrow, and then whatever he said after that to the small boy that was his servant running to get the arrows, that would be code for what David should do. Should he go or should he stay? And Jonathan said, dude, you need to get out of here. So picking it up in chapter 20, 41, as soon as the boy was gone, David came out from where he'd been hiding near the stone pile. Then David bowed 3 times to Jonathan with his face to the ground. Both of them were in tears because now David has to go away. As they embraced each other and said goodbye, especially David. At last, Jonathan said to David, go in peace, for we've sworn loyalty to each other in the Lord's name. The Lord is the witness of a bond between us and our children forever. Then David left, and Jonathan returned home. Well, King Saul continued to pursue and chase David all over the place. And at one moment, when David was particularly discouraged, Jonathan sneaks over into David's camp to where he's hiding. And he does it just to encourage David. In 1 Samuel 23:15, check it out. This is the final interaction between these friends before Jonathan is going to die. He's loyal to David, but he's also going to be loyal to his dad. He's going to follow him into battle at Mount Gilboa, and both father and son are going to lose their lives. Listen to what he says in verse 15. David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh, and Jonathan, Saul's son, rose and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, now listen what he says, do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I'll be next to you. Saul my father also knows this, and the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. David remained at Horesh, and Jonathan went home. They made a covenant the first day, and then on the last day they made another covenant. If Jonathan hadn't been there, just naturally speaking, who knows what would have become of David? But because of Jonathan's faithful friendship, David made it to where he was supposed to get alive. Is this really important, Carter? It really is important. And this might be hard for you to believe, but we need friends to get through life. We need friends, that's your bottom line, to get through life. And I know that it can be hard. It can be hard not to be cynical sometimes. See, if you've had a few friends that maybe didn't do what you thought they were going to do, or they maybe relationally betrayed you in some way that you were counting on them and they didn't come through, we can grow over time just cynical and just think, well, people are not really going to come through. They're not really going to prove to be your friends. But I want to challenge that thinking today. We need friends to get through life. Proverbs 17:17, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. Friends are essential to get through the adversity that we're going to go through. There's stuff that we may think will hold us together, but it won't. Sex won't get us through the hard times. Similar hobbies aren't going to get us through it. Even some kind of symbiotic relationship where you're effective with someone on your workforce, yes, that's great, but it won't get you through the truly hard times. It's going to take more than that. It's going to take friends. Adversity is coming, as you know, and it's going to be friends that help us to get through it and to experience the love of God. Tim Keller says this about our need for friends. He points out that in Genesis 2, even though everything was perfect in the Garden of Eden, the first thing that God said wasn't perfect was it wasn't good for man to be alone. And that doesn't have to be about sex. It doesn't have to be about gender. At the very bottom, what that is most basically about is we need relationships. Even the Garden of Eden isn't enough without friendships. This might be uncomfortable for some, But can you walk with me into the idea for just a second that not having friends, not investing in relationships puts us at a disadvantage, not an advantage?